I don't know, are there any stories in particular that might be especially humorous or amusing?
Well, I remember speaking at Middlesex School, graded school one year, and so I was talking about traffic safety in cars and all, and I mentioned about, cars hit animals and they, you got to be careful because. So one little fellow piped up and said, "Yeah," he says my dad hits deers. I said, "He does what?" "He hits deers." "What do you mean he hits deers?" He runs into deers. Whenever he sees one, he runs into them. I said, "He does?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "What does he do then?" He said, "Oh, he gets out and puts them in the trunk." I said, "Is that right?" And he said, "Yeah." And so then I'm talking down in Poultney one night at the PTA, and I remember this very vividly. This lady and her little boy was sitting in the front row, and I'm talking away there, and the little boy's all the time getting into her pocketbook, and she'd pick up her pocketbook and move him and slam him back down. So anyway, I kept my eye on him as I'm talking, and they must have been Catholic because all of a sudden he gets a rosary out of her pocketbook. And he stands up there in his chair and he's swinging it around like that, and all of a sudden he lets loose of it and he says, "Hang on, Jesus, you're going for a ride." That thing flew across the room, hit the wall. She jumped up, slammed him down in his chair, went over and picked it up, and I can still see it. Yeah, and then this used to happen every once in a while. I'd be talking, especially to the little ones, first, second, third, fourth grade, and I'd be telling them about my background and the fact that I was married and all this and the other thing, and then every once in a while, some little girl would pipe up, "My mother has a boyfriend, wears a uniform just like yours." I said, "She does?" And I didn't want to get into it too much, but I said, "Yeah, and he comes by the house after my dad goes to work." I said, "Oh, is that right?" She said, "Yeah." And so then afterwards the teacher would tell me, she said, "You'd be surprised the stories that we hear from some of these youngsters." And but I used to get a lot of them, and I always felt that work as a safety education officer, I was doing more good than I ever could do riding up and down the highway, chasing speeders or arresting, because I always had a good feeling when the day was over that I'd talked to umpteen hundreds of school kids. Like you figure, say I had an assembly at Montpelier High School. Well, I'd talk to 400 and some kids right there in an hour. And I always felt that if I just did save one person's life in that group, or made one good kid out of that group, it was well worth it. And I'd have to make an annual report every year for the state and all. And I used to find that I invariably over the course of a year, I'd speak to around 400 to 450,000 people at schools, granges, PTAs, playground. Now, see, in the summertime when school was out, I spent all summer speaking. I spoke at every playground in the state. I spoke at every summer camp in the state, 4-H camps, scout camps, so on. I'd spend, and I was talking to a kid one day down at Camp Downer, and he said, and I was a sergeant at that time. He said, Sergeant Curtis, he said, "I think this is the 7th time I've heard you in the last 3 months." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You came to my school." And he said, "I was at the Grange with my folks, and you came there." And he said, "I was at the PTA meeting with my mother, and you came there." And he said, "You spoke at our playground." He said, "Now you're spoken here at our camp." And he said, "I think this is 7 times. I said, "Well, good. Have you got anything out of it?" "Oh, yeah." He said, "I've got a lot out of it." I said, "Well, good. Good." And then I think one of the most rewarding places I used to go was at Camp Thorpe for the blind children. And I speak there in the summertime, and I'd let them come up and feel my badge. They'd come up and they'd feel your badge, and I'd let them feel my handcuffs. And very carefully, I'd let them touch the gun in my holster and all. And they'd run their hands over your face, and it was, to me, that was really, really touching. And to know that they were forming a picture in their mind of you and what your badge looked like and so on. And then I remember another night I was speaking at the Methodist camp up at Camp Missisquoi up near Enosburg, and it was a sort of an open air amphitheater you spoke in, and the kids there, and they were looking at me and they kept giggling, and I said, what the hell is going on? I looked down and there was a bat coming right up the front of my shirt. That's what kids are on. I just brushed it away. But a lot of different experiences, and we used to have one big thing we put on every year was the school patrol picnics. We used to have 2 every year, one in the north and one in the south, and all your school patrol kids would come to the picnic, and we'd feed them all the hot dogs and that they could eat. And speaking of hot dogs, I remember one year up at Champlain Valley Fairgrounds, a couple of the nuns came over to me and said, what are the kids going to have to eat today? I said, well, hot dogs, ice cream, so on. Well, our kids can't eat hot dogs today. What do you mean? Well, it's some kind of a... I said, well, what are we going to do about it? What? They said, well, why don't you get hold of the bishop and see if he can do anything. So I called the diocese office there in Burlington, and they said, yeah, come on over. So I went right over. This is about 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning, and it was Bishop Joyce at that time. And I knew him, and I'm talking to him, and I explained the dilemma we're in. He said, well, I tell you what. He said, couldn't we call them fish dogs? I said, well, I said, your Excellency, we can call them anything you want to call them. He said, well, I tell you what. He said, you get back over to the fairgrounds, and he said, you have one of the sisters call me. And so I went back, and I got hold of one of the sisters from St. Monica's, and so I said, call the diocese office and speak to the bishop. So she came back, kind of had this big smile on her face, and she said, could I use the PA system? I said, sure. She said, I have an announcement to make. So she got on, she said, now, for all of you that were worrying about it, you can eat all the hot dogs you wanted today. The bishop has granted special dispensations. But I'll never forget when he said, well, couldn't we call them fish dogs? And I said, we can call them anything you want.